Yeah, everyone, welcome to the latest and special AMA regarding the newest release of the OriginTrail decentralized network node and protocol version. I'm going to be presenting what's the new developments around the protocol, as well as answering any of your questions that you are invited to pose directly here in the comments. Yes, to introduce myself at first, I'm Branimir. I'm one of the founders and actually the CTO of OriginTrail project. And I'll be trying to briefly introduce today what news we have prepared for you in terms of the latest developments over the last couple of months. So let me jump right into it and set some. I guess the presentation is not set well, so one more time. Okay. So yeah, a little bit about OriginTrail. The "Making Supply Chains Work" slogan is something that is deeply ingrained in the philosophy and vision of OriginTrail. Making supply chains work together. And the idea there is that we're constantly working on various different implementations of the technology within the whole scope of the problems that exist in the supply chains today. There's quite a few things that need to be tackled, and not all of them involve technology. Quite a lot of them actually involve the abilities of us not only building technical networks, but also bringing networks on the, let's say, the layer of people and the layer of organizations. And that's why everything we do, you will see, actually involves the aspect of networking on various different levels. In that regard, I'm going to briefly explain really quickly what we're going to have as topics today, but to quickly reiterate what OriginTrail is currently doing and supporting. There's a wide array of use cases in different business verticals that OriginTrail has already been deployed in, from organic and smart farming to rail track traceability, certifications, and even financial flow tracking, many others as well. And I invite you to join and visit our website to see more details on each of these use cases. But the focus there really is that we're building all of these implementations in such a scope that we always tend to be inclusive and to make these technologies operate in an environment where it's about networking between different entities in this system. So to introduce the agenda today, I already started with a brief introduction, but I'll quickly go into what OriginTrail is, what ODN is, the OriginTrail Decentralized Network, and what its key value propositions are. Then we'll move over to what's the news in the upcoming release, which is hitting the actual network very, very soon, how you can prepare, how you can engage, and finally, we'll also answer all the questions that you guys might have. Potentially, some of them might be even answered during the intro, so I'll just go ahead into it. For those of you who might not know what OriginTrail tries to solve and what actually makes supply chains complicated are the challenges around the industry, and essentially several of them are making kind of large impediments on how companies can actually interact and exchange information in order to achieve several very highly regarded use cases in the industry. And in this slide, you actually see a graph I like to show quite often because it's kind of the one that best illustrates the problem. So if you imagine a very simple linear supply chain in this case, which has a primary producer, processor, a distribution factor, some warehousing in a retailer, which is quite common. Each of these you can imagine sort of as entities of their own or companies of their own, having a certain company behind each of them. And all of these entities in a supply chain interact together on a daily basis. Quite often it doesn't look so linear because supply chains are not really so linear chains, more like in real life they look more like networks. But to illustrate the problem here, what really happens and how technology has evolved so far is that all of this granularity tends to make walled gardens regarding data. So essentially that each of these elements in the supply chain is a data silo of their own. Each company has their own system. They don't necessarily utilize the same standards and ways in how they handle and store information. And essentially they don't know because of this what else is going on outside of their sort of view in the supply chain. So all of the companies pretty much know who they interact with kind of immediately, so their suppliers and who they're the supplier to. But beyond that, like going further from this one step back and one step forward actually tends to be really hard. And there are several different key problems that that make this hard, both technical and also organizational. That is why today you are not able to see for most of today's products that are moving on a certain supply chain. And when we look at that, basically everything around us is a product, from I don't know, this pen to the computer I'm actually streaming this over. All of this has moved along a somewhat of a supply chain like this, and it's really hard to determine quite a few things. Like, for example, where did this the wool in my sweater come from? Has it been sustainably sourced? Has everything been done according to regulation and against some malpractices, like having child labor involved? What's the carbon footprint, and so on? That's quite a few things that we cannot really know because we don't know what's been going on in this supply chain. They're not transparent, and it comes down to being able to gather a lot of this data in an interoperable form and actually being able to see the history of each product as it has been moving and being created through a supply chain. So to go really quickly about how OriginTrail as an ecosystem tries to solve this, OriginTrail approaches the problem through three key principles and pillars. The first pillar being the neutrality, so which we're going to be talking mostly about today. It is really materialized in the OriginTrail decentralized network, which is operating on the OriginTrail protocol, which is open source and neutral, so that it avoids several key problems, one of them being vendor lock-in, as well as the problem of integrity and trust, where actually the open sourceness of the project is heavily invested. Technology needs to be neutral because it also needs to operate with already existing technology. So all the data silos we mentioned in the previous slide, they're going to be there still. They're not going to go away. So we need to build technology that's not going to rip and replace everything that already exists in the world. That would be pretty much impossible. The idea is to somehow upgrade it and see how we can actually connect them and make them work together without replacing all the systems that are already there. The second pillar is the inclusiveness pillar, where the Trace Alliance is actually one of the core materializations of the ecosystem. And inclusiveness in this sense means that that within the Trace Alliance, anyone, any company or individual can find a community where they can share knowledge and start working on the problems that OriginTrail is trying to tackle together. Therefore, I won't be focusing on Trace Alliance too much, but if you're interested, I invite you to visit the website of Trace Alliance and generally the website of the OriginTrail ecosystem, because there's quite a few interesting information there. Not to leave out the third and sometimes most important pillar, the pillar of usability, which is basically something I think that plagues the industry around decentralized technology quite a lot. So there's already a lot of technology built, but it's really, really hard to use. And in that sense, imagine some traditional company trying to utilize such novel and innovative technology. For them, it might be even harder than for someone who is already familiar with blockchain and crypto and has maybe has had the opportunity to use a wallet or something. For companies, it's even harder. So this is where Trace Labs comes in. Trace Labs is actually the materialization of the usability pillar, where as a company, not only developing the OriginTrail open source protocol, but also developing solutions and, in particular, the Trace Labs network operating system as key technology enablers to help companies bridge the gap between decentralized technology and what they need to achieve within their the needs of their supply chains. So Trace Labs focuses on helping them utilize this with their existing technology and with as the least friction possible, I would say. But today we're going to focus on the neutrality part, and we're going to be talking about the protocol. So I'll be moving forward to that and explaining really quickly what OriginTrail, the protocol, is, and what the OriginTrail decentralized network is. So as you can see on this slide, it's basically a purpose-built network that operates on an open source protocol that's specifically designed to exchange data for the use cases in supply chains. And it is supported by blockchain. So if you look at the graph on the right side, you will see actually the blockchain layer at the bottom, where everything gets anchored in. And in that sense, blockchain supports the actual operation of the OriginTrail decentralized network, which is the two middle layers you will see in between. So that's the network and the data layer. And essentially, what happens here in the network is that all of these participants in the first slide that I showed basically get to join the network. And instead of being separate silos, they become part of one single network where they can share data with the formats that they already use. So in that way, the OriginTrail network tackles low data interoperability, tackles the fragmentation, and also prevents vendor lock-in, because in that sense, it doesn't rely on any vendor-specific technology. Everything that's being built within the OriginTrail decentralized network is built in such a way that it can be changed with something else. So, for example, if we look at the blockchain layer, the OriginTrail network currently operates with Ethereum, but that's not the only blockchain it can support. So it can support different blockchains. If you look at the OriginTrail data layer, for example, the key component of the OriginTrail data layer is the OriginTrail, the OriginTrail knowledge graph, which is built on a graph database. And it's not any specific graph database. So essentially, the whole idea of being neutral is that we can implement various different graph databases. And this makes a lot of sense from the perspective of performance as well, because graph databases will be evolving over time, and it makes sense to implement the newest and the most performant ones when they arise. So the idea is to completely abstract that layer into the ability of changing components within in this example the data layer. And I mentioned what really OriginTrail decentralized network is. So basically, the data layer supports a decentralized knowledge graph, and in that sense, the idea being that exchanging data allows data aggregation and connectivity on a decentralized level, so that there's no middle organization that actually gets all this aggregation happening on their own servers, but rather happening on various different locations within the network, depending on what the interests are of each parts of the network. And it's a peer-to-peer network based on a Kademlia implementation in the network layer. So basically, in that sense, it's built as an L2 scalability solution on top of blockchain. What it does is it is specifically tailored to store a large amount of data in a graph, so that you can essentially grow from data towards knowledge in the ability to traverse various different data elements in one single graph. That's not really doable with blockchain because of several reasons. One of the reasons is that blockchains are constrained, and specifically public permissionless blockchains, which, well, a lot of people would only call them blockchains, but not to go into that side of the debate, there's a reason why scale is a problem on the L1 layer, why Ethereum can do 15 transactions per second and Bitcoin even less. Because actually the value propositions of blockchain come from these specific constraints. And there's a lot of talk around scaling, quite also interesting research going on. ZK Sync is the latest thing that sounds pretty cool. But what I'm trying to hint here is that this specific value propositions that blockchain provides, which is the security, immutability, and decentralization, are already there. So basically, OriginTrail decentralized network can go around past these limitations of L1 already, where essentially it takes away the burden of the large amounts of data and enables storage, interconnectivity, and sharing of this data with integrity that is supported by blockchain. So blockchain is utilized in a very lightweight fashion. It allows data fingerprinting on the blockchain for every single data set. So basically, whatever let's say knowledge graph traversal you do, which might span various different data sets, for each of the pieces of the data, you'll be able to find the corresponding fingerprint that you can always check it against on the blockchain. So in that sense, we take the L1 as consensus layer and L2 OriginTrail as a decentralized data network that actually takes away the burden of the blockchain. And just to mention it again, quite often people don't realize how constrained blockchain is. If you look at Ethereum, for example, if you want to publish, I think 1 kilobyte of data at this time costs around $1, which is quite a lot of money. So, and in supply chains, there's a lot of data being exchanged. Not saying that everything needs to be on the blockchain, but in terms of the volume and what kind of use cases it needs to support, especially regarding standardized data, that's what OriginTrail, the network, is there to tackle specifically. So I will continue on further by actually recapping how we've approached development so far. So we started early 2018, and the first version of the protocol, which was at the Apollo stage, was first deployed on the public testnet together with a beta program where our community was contributing in testing and verifying the mechanisms of the network. It was launched in late June 2018, so around a year and a half ago. And all this development really that we've been doing has been done in such a way that basically it has been following the lean development methodology. So we've always tried to stick to lean principles, and that we see what the market needs, and in that sense, basically steer the development towards the direction of usability, where the users are actually going and what their needs are. And on this way, we found quite a few challenges. So we started with the initial design, and then with each iteration, we found quite a few things that we could improve upon, because we actually put these bits of technology into use. And sometimes it's a little hard to figure out the exact challenges before you actually go and deploy, and then but then you actually get this great learnings that you cannot get by being in a laboratory and test hypothetical scenarios. So that's why OriginTrail as the ecosystem is always going to be going towards implementation first and adoption in that sense. So the beginning of version 1, we actually learned quite a few things. So we built a bidding mechanism that was not perfect. It was the first version, and it needed quite a few optimizations because it was high in cost. And We also realized that from the feedback of the community that we needed to improve the user experience, also improve the failover mechanisms in the node, and optimize the smart contracts. All of this, by the way, that I'm talking about can be seen on our blog. So whoever wants to find out more details about it, feel free to jump on Medium. Everything is pretty much explained there. Then moving forward in December last year, so a bit over a year ago, we launched the first stage of the mainnet, which is the Vostok mainnet stage, and which is currently still ongoing. So we're currently in version 2.0.59, and we've actually updated the billing mechanism from Apollo. We decreased the cost significantly. We also fixed the problem of distribution within the replication mechanism, which was not always the way we intended it to be by design. Improved the UX a lot. If you were with us at the beginning, you might remember that the ERC 725 support was not there yet before Vostok. We also improved a lot on key management and introduced automatic updates. So if you are basically, if you want to make sure that your node is always up to date and that you want to have the ability to update manually when you want or automatically when you want, we actually introduced this feature as well. And then several important updates also in the core of the protocol. But the most important learnings was that we actually, when we tried to implement some use cases, we had limits in capacity, especially in the data layer. This is specifically geared towards supply chain events. So the more events would happen, and the more events would come in for the network to ingest with one single data set, the harder it would be on the nodes. And essentially, we realized that there were certain bottlenecks there that we needed to take out, and actually we decided to tackle sort of in joint way towards the way the roadmap was moving, which is the next stage, V3, which I'll jump on really quickly. And we also realized that we should try to optimize for the cost further. But these were the two main learnings from the operation of the use cases that we've been doing with enterprises so far. And the reason there being that, like I said, OriginTrail as a network is ready to take over enterprise use cases, and enterprises are already seeking stability on layer 2. So essentially, already at stage of Vostok, the network is perfectly stable, even regardless of changes of L1. For example, the couple of days ago, there was the Istanbul fork of Ethereum network, which went completely smoothly. So there's no issues like you might have heard of that other projects might have had, unfortunately, because there were breaking changes in the fork. But essentially, the network, because of this lightweight use, the OriginTrail network doesn't have such a sort of a tight coupling with blockchain that it has the issue that it might be unstable because L1, as well as the L2 blockchain, the L2 of OriginTrail itself is already stable enough and tested for a long period already. So, but the capacity limits were there, so we went ahead, and so the next stage, which was intended for in the original roadmap, was to go to the Freedom stage, and that was the main driver there was to introduce the litigation mechanism and basically test it in a public environment, which we did in March this year. Was litigation and Freedom version of the protocol V3 was launched on the testnet, and it's been there ever since. We've done quite a lot of tests because this is an important feature that needs to be monitored quite well in an operational public environment. It took some time to realize all the potential flaws of it and how we can optimize and make it secure. And basically, in this regard, there's been a lot of monitoring where the team has made great progress, and that basically the litigation was tested out on the testnet and ready to move towards the next stage. But another thing we really realized that both V2 and V3, which is like V2 was on mainnet and V3 was on testnet, had also certain limits towards data model flexibility. It was tailored and built from the beginning on to support GS1 standards, most specifically EPCIS. But at certain points, we realized that this also brings a little bit of, I would say, constraints in terms of data modeling. So it made a lot of sense to expand the support and to enable various different cases, because it was giving us a hard time when we were implementing the use cases. So lots of hours can be now saved with a more flexible data model. And also, like I said, the increase in the capacity was needed to support larger use cases. And finally, of course, it's always been something of a concern and I would say important element in running the whole network and the ecosystem is to make it usable, so that we realize that we need to focus more on how one manages their own node, how can they set up the pricing, and generally in configuration. So we realized that this is something that needs to be introduced before the features of Freedom go onto the mainnet. So instead of having the original plan of Freedom stage being going before the Gemini stage, we realized that with the new knowledge and facts we figured out from the use cases, we should merge these two stages and have version 4 basically, or someone calling it, we call it sometimes Freedom stage 2. Actually, this really is a merge of Freedom and Gemini stages. And in that sense, this is the next stage of the mainnet, which I'm actually proud to announce in the name of the whole OriginTrail team that it's going to be launched on December 26th this year. So I'm really happy to actually say that we've made all these great improvements, and that we're going to have all these features that we've set ourselves for these stages come onto the network according to the roadmap and without any delays. So I'm using this opportunity to say congrats to our team, because the developers have been doing a great job. And what happened basically is we increased the capacity orders of magnitude higher to what it was before. We're still actually testing some final limits to see what is like the biggest data set that can go in the network. Now that also depends on every single node. But essentially, the idea there is that right now this is capacity which goes way beyond what the use cases so far have needed, and that's going to mean more support for more different use cases in the very near future. We also improved upon the network layer as well with the new Kademlia implementation, and also removing the approval registration mechanism. So basically Freedom as it was intended in the first initial plan. And I'm going to go into specifics of the features for Freedom-Gemini, but really quickly to go to the next stage, which is version 5, planned for this year as well, is that we implement obviously the learnings from the new stage of version 4, Freedom-Gemini, but as well as to do updates in the litigation mechanism that were planned according to the design. So it's the litigation mechanism still has room for expansion, and also to introduce the data marketplace features, which we've already started working on. So essentially, one of the projects that Trace Labs is involved in is the project called Food Data Market, which is one of the first that is going to be utilizing the data marketplace features of the OriginTrail network. And the idea there being is that we're building a decentralized marketplace which supports a privacy by design marketplace, which is built around the principles of human centrism. So the idea there being that the responsibility and the accountability of data being shared and basically exchanged through the marketplace, tokenized in that way, is done through the actual decentralized network, and that different layers and levels of privacy are available for everyone who is trying to monetize their data. There's already quite a lot of progress on the project, but I won't go too further into it. So that's just a brief introduction of where the development is going to be heading in 2020. Now, to go further and explain what's new in the release, I'll try to be as specific as possible, but feel free to ask any questions in the chat. So I'm basically going to go through all of them one by one. So I already mentioned litigation and reputation. Essentially, the why of litigation and reputation is that it's designed to preserve dataset longevity on the network. So each dataset that is being published on the network gets a certain data lifespan that the DH nodes are supposed to accomplish. So they're supposed to keep this dataset for a certain amount of time. And if they do not, then the litigation mechanism is there to heal the knowledge graph in that sense. So whatever DH node doesn't stops operating for some reason, another node can come and replace it, and in that regard, continue on the work that was supposed to be done by the original node. In this way, the litigation ensures that the replication on the network and the agreements are completed, and it actually supports a reputation mechanism. So we're in this version 4 introducing the first reputation mechanism that is basically assigning points towards reputational points to each of the nodes that interact in peer-to-peer fashion. So every node keeps track of all the nodes that it has been interacting in agreements with, and takes care of the way that these agreements have happened. So if a certain node has always been problematic in these agreements, any node that interacts with it has the decision to decide if they want to work with them or not. So that is essentially a basic design, and of course it's going to be something that grows and evolves with the network. But having that said, this is the initial stage where we will be monitoring and testing the reputation mechanisms, which essentially at this moment allow nodes to choose on the basis of reputation with whom they want to operate with. The replacement mechanism in litigation is important because it requires a certain amount of collateral, so stake, that's posted before the actual job is being completed. So every DH node, in order to get compensated for the work in this agreement, posts a certain amount of stake. And in this version, the version 1 of litigation, basically what ends up happening with even though there's an exchange with stake, is very simply that if your node, the DH node, has let's say 70% of the time of the agreement already done, and for some reason it stops working, it will get compensated for these 70% of the time, and another node will jump in for the next 30% and take over what work there is left to do, and of course the tokens intended for this part, and the 30% of the token. So that's kind of like the easiest way to introduce it. And in that sense, it's pretty fair. So the idea there is not being to have someone be offline from the network for a couple of seconds and then be penalized by a certain node which catches the other node for a couple of seconds offline. The actual mechanism is not designed in such a way, so the nodes have a certain period of time to recover, and the litigation actually happens first off-chain, where nodes communicate to each other, challenge each other to see if the data is still there and kept in the form that it's supposed to be kept. And if this off-chain communication basically doesn't go through, and if then the actual communication is moved to L1, so where the blockchain smart contracts can be utilized as arbiters of basically determining if this challenge can be solved or not. And if the challenge is solved, then everything stays the same. It's okay. If it's not solved, then it can be for the reason of data not being available. So in that sense, a certain other node would be there to replace the H node that hasn't delivered the service. So that's in brief litigation. What's new, and I think probably one of the most exciting news, is how we set up pricing in version 4. So we've received a lot of feedback, and in this feedback, one of the key things was that it's really hard to understand how to set up the price. And in that regard, we decided to again go from the approach of creating a very good user experience designed for both the DC and the DH nodes. And we introduced something that is called the lambda factor. And I'll explain it briefly, but I'll start with one of the key concerns that the community had, was that sometimes that the cost of the withdrawal of the tokens once the job is finished was on par or even higher from the actual amount of compensation that the node would get for a certain job, which depends on a lot of things: the current cost of gas, on the length of a job, but also most importantly on the settings, on the pricing. So if, let's say, it was easier to set up the pricing, we would have much less of these problems, and that's what we did. So the idea here is that by default, your node tries, in version 4, tries to estimate what would be the cost just to withdraw the tokens. And then it includes 2 times this cost. So this is in this equation, the P is for price. The 2 times W, which is the withdrawal cost, is basically already included. So your node should not start doing anything before it's pretty sure that it will be able to at least not be at a cost. And by the way, this formula is in the code, so it can be edited. So any node can go, anyone can go and edit the actual formula the way they want. What is important is the resulting price. So if a certain offer on the network doesn't satisfy your price, whatever way you calculated it, your node should not apply for this offer. And in that regard, we've designed this formula that actually takes into account 2 of the most important variables, so the file size and data lifespan. And we designed a relatively simple function to understand, which has the lambda factor. The lambda factor is basically intended to be a user experience, I would say, kind of a what is the word in English? Kind of like a knob for the price, where you can basically set the price by determining just one factor, and that's the lambda factor. The idea there being that you can go ahead and basically just tune this one factor, and the formula will adjust the rest because it's already there, the withdrawal cost, the file size, and data lifespan. And why specifically this formula? Because if you look on the graph on the right, you will see a model, a very simple model, where this formula illustrates how the price acts according to the actual multiplier of the file size and the data lifespan. The idea there being that if a node has to keep a bigger file for the same amount of time, it doesn't. The price should not linearly rise. This is a sublinear function, as you can see. And in that sense, the reason there being because the costs are the same. So you're paying the same withdrawal cost, the same cost to maintain hardware or VPS or wherever you're hosting your node. If your node has 20 gigabytes to spare, and if it takes 1 megabyte or 10 megabytes of data, or 1 gigabyte of data in one offer, it would make sense that the price increase is not moving linearly toward the way it will work with a usual linear function. So, but like I said, this is also something that can be changed, and ideally, instead of just changing the formula, anyone can change the lambda. So basically, switch it, turn it on and off, and you can increase the price, and but you always start from 2 times the actual withdrawal cost, and in that sense, it's much harder to get into the trouble we had before. Moving on, because I already see it's taking too long for me to explain everything. We have a new Houston interface, and the idea is that, again, instead of having Houston and the node profile interface, which I'm sure if you're a node holder you know about, the idea there is that we merge these 2 interfaces, that we have one Houston that can do everything, and where you can basically see the whole status of the node, the offer overview, all the necessary information. You can configure the pricing. You can configure other node parameters, basically anything you can do also from the config file. And you can manage the tokens, manage your wallets, your identities. So basically, one single place to work with your node in a much easier way than actually going into the command line and changing parameters and doing it on the spot. And then what's new about the Houston is we're going to open source, of course, again, this new in a new repository, because we're switching to a bit of a different way the project works. I won't go too much into it. I'll touch upon it a moment later, but I'll open up for the questions as soon as possible. Probably one of the most important updates, the actual infrastructurally most important updates are coming in the data layer and the network layer. And like I said, I already talked about the increased capacity. What I didn't say is that how we generalized and how we made the whole data layer more flexible. So I actually introduced OT-JSON as a JSON LD-based protocol native data format, where everything, if you look at this graph from an external data level, be it at, let's say, GS1, EPCIS files, or WOT, Web of Things data sets, or any other data set, can be met into this generic graph structure. And this generic graph file, which basically you can convert directly from one to the other, so it's a one-to-one relationship always, then goes deeper into the graph and finally ends up in the database. And what this enables is a completely decoupled infrastructure. So it's much easier now to introduce new data models and data standards. Everything that can be translated to OT-JSON only needs an additional converter in between, and basically anyone can contribute and build one as long as it relies on OT-JSON and the underlying import. Also, there's a very important feature, the connector feature, which, by the way, all of this is, there's quite a few links on the documentation on how this works specifically. If you go to the roadmap page, so there's a couple of links that we posted there, as well as in our documentation. The connector basically allows certain companies to publish disparate data sets that talk about the same event, and that these data sets can get connected in a verifiable, cryptographically verifiable way. So that basically company A claims that something has happened and that they're expecting company B to be involved in the event, and vice versa. Company B says, okay, I'm expecting company A's cryptographic signature to arrive in this other data set, and they also agree on a certain value of whatever the event they're talking about. So essentially an interlock between data happens, which is cryptographically secure. There's no way for, let's say, an imposter third party to come in and somehow get connected on the same data set, because that would defeat the purpose of integrity. And then finally, what I haven't mentioned so far, but we mentioned before, is that basically there's a new data layer API which is important because if you've been building on the current version of the network, you should check out the documentation because it includes a couple of breaking changes, as well as a lot of improvements. So there's going to be a much cleaner API. We've introduced versioning and quite a few things that help with user experience, specifically the Trail API call, which helps on actually connecting the traversing the data through the knowledge graph. This specifically has been something that has been important in regards to the use cases that have been deployed and we've been working with over the last year and a half. And specifically, the value coming from having a very easy way to integrate systems was something that took a lot of time. That it wasn't as easy as it is with the new API. So I encourage everyone to take a look at it. And essentially, this makes the friction much smaller. In terms of interoperability as well, it helps because you can always, from this moment on, once the version 4 is out, you can always retrieve the original data sets back in the original format, or even try to convert them in another format that suits you. But most importantly, we achieve interoperability across data sets. So it's no longer disparate files existing in some place, but it's really one big data set connected through the knowledge graph. So in that regard, that is kind of the main point and the main reason why the data layer was such a significant element in the development. I focused on on the few important features. By the way, one of the key things there is that we also are looking into how to help with the pricing and general UX, so that the actual community can have an easier time both working with the node as well as having more control over the ROI of the node. Because if the ROI is not there, then it actually that doesn't give the right incentive for the network, obviously. So that's where the pricing comes in, as well as removing the friction of joining the network. So the actual approval mechanism that was there with the Vostok version of the mainnet is being removed with the new version 4 of the protocol. And that's coming up as soon as the version lands on the mainnet, with an additional aspect of an increased in the minimal stake that needs to be posted onto the network in order for the node to operate. These two features come in parallel. So basically, in order for the network to be able to operate, every single node needs to be registered in the smart contract with a certain amount of stake. And this amount of stake is there for several reasons, one of them being the actual incentive and security into the network. So essentially what each node needs to post is kind of a starting beginning amount of trace that they operate with. This stake can always not, of course, be taken out when you no longer want to utilize your node. And in that regard, the increase here is to actually reflect the removal of the approval mechanism, and it's going to be happening at a certain moment in time. We targeted for January 15th noon by Central European time, because from this moment on, every node will have to have at minimum this amount of stake in order to be able to interact with other nodes on the network. What happens if you don't manage to do this in time? Well, your node will just not be responding to offers. So, but it's not going to be a problem if you're late as soon as you pose the stake, basically the node will continue on operating. And in that sense, we're tentatively targeting it for January 15th, so everyone has time to prepare and to get informed and update by then. So essentially, yeah, I guess it's already an hour in, so let me move ahead. How to actually prepare for the update. So, of course, first always backup, and there's a script that comes with the node that you can utilize to actually back it up. So we'll post all the instructions, of course, in a separate document, and then basically we encourage a timely update for all the nodes in the network because of the new features that are coming up. If you have auto update enabled, then the node will basically update automatically. What will be required is just to do a restart at a certain point, because the node needs to reboot to take advantage of all the new code and the underlying mechanisms. And basically we'll be posting all of the detailed instructions within the next week. But even if you don't have auto update on, you can also update manually. So it's just a bit of a longer process. But essentially it's up to you to decide. And there will be enough information, materials, and also the ability to ask questions via Discord to help you transition to the new version of the protocol. How can you engage? Basically, there's several ways you can join. As part of the ecosystem, you can start contributing to both the OT node and Houston development repositories. We're going to be publishing a good first issues tag on the GitHub, so repositories. So you can basically go ahead and have an easier way of joining in if you are interested into the development of the protocol. So so far it's always been possible, but sometimes I know it's a little hard to jump in directly into the code. It's not too complicated, but it might seem. So the idea is to utilize the good practice of good first issues, and we're going to be posting them soon on GitHub so that you can basically take some relatively easy task that you can start with. You can contribute to the pull request, and then you know, basically have part of what you might need or you think makes sense to join into the protocol actually merged with the code of both Houston or OT node. One of the things you could, for example, do at the beginning without just going into first issues is creating a converter. So if there's a certain data model that makes that is useful for you, it might be useful for others as well. So it makes sense to make a converter that, of course, satisfies certain criteria in order for it to work with the node. That's one of the cool things that also could be done. That's kind of not that hard and to start with. Of course, everyone's invited to submit their pull requests, also to engage in OT RFCs. And if someone's not aware of what RFCs are, it's a shorthand for request for comments. And we published the first 5 requests for comments a while ago, actually, on our documentation page, where you can basically see the details of how the protocol operates. And in that regard, any comments, because it's intended for comments and feedback, are very, very welcome. Any improvement that you might come up with, we would really, really like to see that, and that you tell it to us, so we can somehow incorporate it, ideally together in the code. What else can you do? You can run a node, obviously. That would be very beneficial for the network, and actually also for you as either a developer in the ecosystem, or someone who's implementing use cases, or someone who is just wants to contribute with their node to the decentralization and security of the network for a certain amount of incentivization, of course. And then you can join our communication channels, get to know people, exchange ideas. And finally, and I actually want to make an ask of you to do it, to spread the word, to tell people about what we're doing, what the OriginTrail mission is about, how it can be used and how it can be used today, how companies are already using it, what problems it tackles, because we could really easily see quite a lot of uptake in different areas where we don't even necessarily see a huge potential at this moment. And this is open source technology that anyone can utilize. It is designed for anyone that has the problems that it's designed to tackle. So feel free to mention it to your fellow developers or colleagues in your company that might need some solutions that could be built on top of the OriginTrail decentralized network. It would definitely be something that they might be interested in, because at this moment we're finding quite a lot of interest in the network and the way the problems that it can tackle. So I encourage you to spread the word through any sort of channel you might see fit, and of course get in touch via communication channels if you have good ideas that we can work together on. Okay, so that was for the intro. I didn't intend it to be this long, but I hope this gave quite a comprehensive intro. Okay, so let me see. How can I see the questions here? 1 second. Hey team, can you help me with the list of questions, please? Okay, just a moment. I apologize for the brief pause. Just trying to get into your questions. Okay, so okay, I see the questions they're coming in slowly. So let me start with the first one is I think this is okay. How will existing jobs be affected by the network upgrade? Will they be completed? Will there be no jobs active left before the upgrade? That's a very good question. Essentially, this upgrade is there to focus on establishing the network in such a way that it can transition relatively smoothly. The jobs that are currently active on the network will be completed in that regard, that all the nodes that are currently having jobs that are going potentially past the date of December 26th will be finalizing all these jobs at the date, and then when moving towards the new version, then the jobs will basically, the new jobs will be coming in. So in that regard, there's no sort of break in terms of your node maybe not having completed some sort of how would I say it, obligation towards a certain job, and that means that transitioning towards the new network will be done in such a way that jobs will be either, depending on the use case, either some jobs might be paused, some might be uptaken again, or some might be reposted on the new version of the network. Now, obviously, we don't work with all the companies that are using the network. So for them, and I think there's another question. Have current company? Yeah, so that's basically what I was about to say. Have current companies using the ODN been alerted to these changes, and are they ready to take advantage of the new Freedom release? Yeah, so basically all the companies, like I said, we don't know everyone who's using it, so we're announcing the update so they can get ready. But essentially the companies that we know, we've already been in communication with, and the use cases that are already being deployed with our partners are all being taken care of. So in that sense, it's something that that is not going to be an issue in regards to the update. But having that said, we don't know everyone. So it's a decentralized network, so anyone can use it. There's no permission really there. So having that said, I actually use this opportunity as well to invite anyone who's utilizing the network to get informed, to go through the documentation and potentially ask questions if needed on the new version and how they can upgrade regarding the new node. Okay. Is it safe to say that some nodes will want higher resources than the standard recommendation? Okay, cool. I see the question coming up on screen. Cool. Is it safe to say that some nodes will want higher resources than the standard recommendation, more storage to hold more jobs, more RAM to help process bigger jobs? Yeah, essentially, the node with higher resources is going to be able to handle more things, obviously. So if you don't have enough space to take another job, the node will just not do it. And so having that said, it helps both the network and whoever's the node operator to have more RAM or more space to handle it. More RAM is specifically important if a very large data set is something that you would like to handle with a node. So a data set which has a lot of supply chain events, like specifically PCIS events, can be quite intensive in terms of RAM. So if, like, let's say you're taking a data set of a gigabyte size, it's going to take some time and some RAM to actually process and get into the knowledge graph. And that's one of the kind of the aspects of why it will be really, really hard to do this with blockchain itself. But essentially, yes, it's safe to say that it might make sense that you have more resources so you can actually offer more to the network, so that you can take in bigger data sets for, and that you can essentially also take more data in the network. Okay. Yeah, what was the next question? So one of the questions, can we expect more jobs on the ODN with the Gemini release? Okay, I see. Yeah, it's on the screen. By Cloud S. Okay. Yeah. So from the perspective of what we already mentioned, mostly in the previous hour that I've been explaining the new features, essentially the idea there is that we enable the technology to be able to support more use cases, and specifically around the constraints we've been touching upon so far. So in that regard, the most important features for adoption are definitely the ones that are coming with the Gemini release, in terms of the data layer being more versatile in terms of the use cases it can support, meaning the flexibility in the data, specifically the data models. So right now, the way Gemini is designed, the Freedom-Gemini data layer specifically is designed, is that it can be a holistic ontology for a graph that can map, let's say, the data multiple different standards much easier than it was possible with the previous versions, and that's going to help lessen the friction on implementations quite a lot. So orders of magnitude a lot, I must say, because we've been experiencing this friction ourselves as well. And so that from the flexibility side, it's going to be much easier, and therefore the adoption is going to be much easier to achieve. But also the other part is the scale, so that we can actually take in a lot of data and enabling much more use cases that the network can support. But additionally, also I would go ahead and also touch upon the pioneer stage, which is also going to introduce some interesting aspects into the network. So essentially, all of the new features that are coming up with the development are coming from the perspective of adoption. We're trying to learn as much as possible from the market and see what they actually need, what the companies need for their specific verticals and their specific use cases, and in this way remove all the obstacles that we know of for adoption. So having that said, any single development that I've talked about has always been there to help the ecosystem grow. So from the perspective of node holders, one of the key concerns was the pricing, and in terms of adoption and growing the network in that regard, from that side, we've tried to focus on that because we believe that's one of the biggest frictions. On the other side, and also the general user experience of the node. So needs to be easier to do work with your node. It needs to be easier to set it up, as well as from the side of the companies, which is even more important adoption-wise. And in that regard, it's still there were still hurdles that we needed to take away from the stage of Vostok, and there will surely be more things that we will be learning along the way. This is a innovative, novel technology that's evolving, and basically on this path we will see more of the things that need to be improved in order for further adoption and easier utilization. But we're getting there, and I'm really excited about the new features we've been building for months that are going to hit the network soon. Okay, let me see what's the next question. After being involved with blockchain technology for a few years now, what is your opinion on the progress of blockchain adoption overall? That's a very good question. In general, I think everyone was hoping that there's going to be more adoption sooner, right? Which we can go into reasons for that. But and I'm saying this as a technical person, I don't believe necessarily that the technology is the biggest. The technology is there. The technology itself already can be utilized. If the problem is that not everyone really knows how to utilize it. My opinion, personal opinion, is that blockchain technology is really great technology in general, and that it's, well, I wouldn't be working in any other technology environment at this point. This is for I'm sure people know reasons why it's super exciting, and the whole topic of decentralization is amazing. I think it's going to change the world, and that's why we're working on it. But not everything can be solved with blockchain, and I think there's still quite a lot of misunderstanding on what it can be used for. So we actually come from the perspective, kind of a different perspective. So we were not a blockchain first company. We started as a company that was building supply chain solutions way before blockchain was a thing in supply chain, and that is what I think is kind of like lacking in the industry a bit, because we see a lot of people building a lot of infrastructure, but not necessarily being able to map it to the why. to what is the use case. Where do you use it in the real world today, not 10 years from now, but like literally today. And that is what we're trying to do with every single implementation we're doing. So we're going the other way. So as a company, starting from supply chain problems, we map the problems towards the blockchain, and the blockchain, as you can see, is part of the solution. It has great value propositions, even as it is right now. So it doesn't necessarily require thousands of transactions in order to be useful. And maybe an analogy comes to mind. So it would be kind of like, let's say that every single piece of technology has its place, and the traditional database is going to be here for a long time. It's probably never going to go away in a certain way. It just solves one problem really well, and that is how you manage data. And if it's relational data, then a relational database makes sense. And there's a lot of great theory and a lot of practical knowledge developed around this. So it wouldn't make sense to change the winning team in one certain aspect. And what I'm trying to say is that blockchain is going to be one type of technology like this. Like you have a database for certain things is great, and blockchain is going to be great for certain things, and then SMTP protocol is going to be great for some things. Everything is going to be the way we use them. So if we try to put something on blockchain that should not be there, then that's not going to help with adoption. The only way it's going to help is where it brings value, where it brings value more than the other technologies. From the perspective of OriginTrail, it brings value within the integrity that it can support already on L2. So the already existing data, the already existing systems can be networked on L2, and whenever there's a need to find the integrity or to establish a protocol where companies can interact in a certain way according to certain rules, blockchain makes a lot of sense. But overusing it and making everything go on chain just won't work, and there's no need to. So I think the adoption is going to come from the perspective of us focusing more on how the technology is useful and not trying to apply it on every single possible thing. And I think the industry is slowly going there. It's going to be exciting. Exciting times are coming. Very excited about the developments around the Ethereum community as well. So I think there's quite a lot of interesting research happening there. But again, I don't think the adoption is going to come from someone figuring out a more kind of a more technical, low-level solution to a certain problem. I think we're a bit in the comfort zone, to be honest, as technologists, because everything is super exciting in the blockchain world. We tend to dig deep and then forget that somewhere on top we need to build an application that's useful for a regular person who's not knowledgeable about blockchain. So this gap is something that needs to be bridged, and the technology gap is where OriginTrail, the protocol, helps a lot, and the general ecosystem is there where the gap is on kind of like, I would say, the upper layers, Trace Labs building applications, companies like Trace Labs, as well as the networking that needs to be involved. So I hope that answers the question a bit. What challenges or pushbacks do you receive when proposing blockchain solutions to companies? Yeah, okay. Again, from Miljan. Thanks for the questions, Miljan. Yeah, so I think there's a couple of problems. One I already mentioned. The biggest kind of challenge would be that there's a lot of noise in people's heads. People have heard all kinds of things from all kinds of articles and, I don't know, social networks that blockchain can do this and that, and quite often I think are misinformed. So sometimes the technology cannot really do what people kind of think it can. The other problem is that everybody seems to have an opinion that we're waiting for a certain scale before it's going to be useful. So it's kind of one of the challenges. One of the things that need to be tackled from the beginning is these two. So what is basically what blockchain is and what it isn't, and then kind of the biggest other thing is that there's no need to wait. That actually pioneering in this space is already going on for a while, and that the technology is ripe and ready, if used properly, to be supporting use cases in production on mainnet today. And that is something that's kind of like the beginning of myth busting that needs to happen at the beginning when proposing blockchain solutions. Of course, obviously illustrating where the value in each use case lies. And because we need to finish off, I think maybe an analogy here makes sense again. I like analogies, so I'll try to explain through one more. I think people are making a mistake trying to pitch blockchain. Like you come to a company and you pitch blockchain as itself, but blockchain is really a kind of a lower level protocol. So it's very high tech, deep into the stack of technologies that you need to use in order to build a useful solution for someone that utilizes blockchain. It would be somewhat like trying to go, even today, but like imagine years ago when that technology was new, trying to pitch HTTP as a protocol to someone. And you could come to a company and say, hey, I got this great HTTP protocol for you. It's going to solve all these great things. But it's 1996 and people haven't even seen the likes of mobile phones, Ubers, Gmail, and whatever type of services we're using today. Like this streaming service I'm on right now, which is also accessed through it has HTTPs involved in all of this, what I'm trying to say. But no one's really pitching that today. Everyone's pitching the solution. So I think we need to focus more on the user and on the usability in order to get the technology being more adopted, better understood, and not going technology first, but more going problem first, and then finding the solution. And part of the solution is blockchain. Just as part of the solution to every product that we use online today is somewhere in there HTTP is used. And I'm pretty sure a very marginal percent of people in the world know how HTTP works. Most of us have only seen it in the URL that you type into your browser. But it's super powerful and revolutionizing technology, the internet itself. And that's the same way the same thing is going to happen with blockchain. I have no doubt about it. So it's just a matter of how we look at it. Okay, team, I have to get going because we're out of time. Thank you for the questions. I hope it was informative. We will be publishing more articles on how to transition to the new network, what you can do with the new node. I invite you to go and visit our website, get informed in the documentation, especially if you would like to contribute to the code. Let us know. We're available on Discord or Twitter. We're also on our GitHub, obviously, all the time. So whoever wants to join in, feel free to approach us. That would be it. Thank you for the time and the attention. This has been Branimir signing off from Belgrade, and see you next time. Looking forward to seeing the network update on December 26th. Okay, bye everyone.